No one believed Jack Thornton when he first told them he had saved a dying bear's life deep in the Cascade Mountains. "You've lost your mind," they said. "Wild animals have no memory for kindness," they warned. But 3 years later, when that same bear emerged from the forest on a snowy December morning and did something that defied explanation, every single person who had doubted him stood in stunned silence, forced to reconsider everything they thought. They knew about the natural world. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This extraordinary story begins on the harshest day of winter in 2021, in the remote wilderness of Washington State's North Cascades. Jack was 38, a wildlife photographer who had moved to the small town of Pinecrest 5 years earlier, seeking solitude after a career as a trauma surgeon in Seattle. The mountains had always called to him, even during the most chaotic days in the emergency room. Now, he spent his days capturing images of the wild creatures that most people never get to see in their natural habitat. That fateful morning, the thermometer outside his cabin read 15 degrees below zero. A brutal cold front had swept through overnight, bringing with it nearly 2 feet of fresh powder. Most residents of Pinecrest were huddled inside their homes, waiting for the storm to pass. But Jack had received a tip from a local ranger about a family of elk that had been spotted in the eastern valley, a rare opportunity for the perfect winter shot. He packed his camera gear, extra batteries that he kept warm against his body, enough supplies to last 2 days if he got stranded, and headed out at dawn. His truck could only make it so far up the logging road before the snow became too deep, forcing him to continue on snowshoes. 3 miles into his trek, in a section of old-growth forest where the trees stood like ancient guardians, Jack heard a sound that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up, a guttural moan of pain that seemed to echo through the frozen wilderness. Every local who lived in bear country knew the fundamental rules of survival. First, always make noise when hiking to avoid surprising wildlife. Second, if you hear an animal in distress, keep your distance. Wounded animals are unpredictable and dangerous. Third, never, under any circumstances, get between a bear and its food or cubs. These weren't just guidelines. They were the difference between life and death in the backcountry. Jack knew these rules better than most. He had photographed enough bears to understand their power and unpredictability. But something about that sound, the raw anguish in it, made him break all 3 rules that morning. He followed the noise, moving quietly through the thick forest, his camera forgotten as he pushed aside snow-laden branches. What he found in a small clearing made his stomach turn. A massive black bear, a male judging by its size, lay partially buried in snow, its massive paw caught in the metal jaws of an illegal trap. Blood had frozen in dark pools around the animal, and its breathing was labored, creating small clouds in the frigid air. The bear's eyes were glazed with pain, but there was still a spark of life in them, and something else Jack couldn't quite name. Intelligence, perhaps, or resignation. Most people would have retreated, called the wildlife authorities, and hoped the bear would somehow survive until help arrived. That would have been the sensible choice, the safe choice. But Jack Thornton wasn't most people. Before he became a photographer, he had spent 12 years in emergency medicine, his hands steady, under pressure, saving lives when others would have given up. That part of him, the healer, had never really gone away. Jack knew that in these temperatures, with this much blood loss, the bear wouldn't survive another hour, let alone the time it would take for rangers to arrive. The nearest ranger station was 30 miles away, and in this weather it might as well have been 1,000. As he stood there, watching the bear's labored breathing, Jack made a decision that would change not just the bear's life, but his own, in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. "I'm going to help you," he said aloud, his voice sounding strange in the silent forest. The bear's eyes seemed to focus on him momentarily, tracking his movement with what Jack would later swear was understanding. With cautious steps, Jack retreated to a safe distance and pulled out his satellite phone. He called Elena Vasquez, the town veterinarian and his closest friend in Pinecrest. Elena had experience with wildlife rehabilitation before settling in the small mountain community. "You're going to do what?" Elena's voice crackled through the static. "Jack, that's suicide. You can't treat a wounded bear in the wild." "It'll die if I don't," Jack replied, his mind already made up. "I need you to tell me what to do. I've got my emergency medical kit, but I need to know what medications I can use from it that won't kill a bear." There was a long pause on the line. "This is crazy," Elena finally said, "but I know you'll do it with or without my help. I'd rather it be with." She proceeded to give him detailed instructions about dosages, wound treatment, and how to approach the animal with minimal risk. Jack made one more call, to Marcus Reed, the only person in town he trusted who might understand what he was about to do. Marcus had been a wilderness guide for 20 years before arthritis in his knees forced him into semi-retirement. "I need your help," Jack explained the situation, "and I need you to bring the bolt cutters from your shed, the industrial ones." "You've finally lost it, haven't you?" Marcus replied, but Jack could hear him already moving around, gathering supplies. "I'll be there as fast as I can. Don't do anything stupid until I arrive." "No promises," Jack said, ending the call. While waiting for Marcus, Jack began the delicate process of approaching the injured bear. He removed his heavy coat despite the bone-chilling cold, knowing that restricted movement could mean the difference between life and death if the bear lunged. Moving in slow, deliberate motions, he began talking in a low, calm voice, the same tone he had used with frightened children in the emergency room. "I know you're scared, I know you're in pain, but I'm going to help you if you'll let me." The bear watched him, its breathing shallow, but its eyes alert. As Jack inched closer, he could see the full extent of the damage. The trap, an illegal and barbaric device with serrated metal teeth, had nearly severed the bear's right front paw. Bone was visible where the metal had cut through flesh and fur, and infection had already set in, evidenced by the swelling and discoloration around. The wound. Using all his knowledge as a trauma surgeon, Jack assessed the situation. The bear had lost a dangerous amount of blood, was severely dehydrated, and the risk of septic shock was high. Without intervention, death was not just possible but inevitable. With intervention, the chances were still grim, but there was a possibility, a slim one, that the bear might survive. Jack reached into his pack and prepared a syringe with a sedative, following Eleanor's instructions on dosage. Getting close enough to administer it without being mauled would be the first massive hurdle. He knew that despite its weakened state, the bear could still kill him with one swipe of its uninjured paw. "This will help with the pain," Jack said, quietly, moving forward inch by inch on his knees through the snow. The bear's eyes never left his, and Jack would later tell people that in that moment something passed between them, an understanding, a connection that defied explanation. The massive animal, which could have ended his life in seconds, instead watched with what Jack could only describe as trust as he slowly extended the syringe. With a swift, practiced motion, Jack injected the sedative into the muscle of the bear's shoulder. He retreated quickly, moving out of reach of those powerful claws, and waited for the medication to take effect. It took nearly 20 minutes. 20 minutes of Jack kneeling in the snow, watching, waiting, ready to run if necessary. Gradually the bear's eyelids grew heavy, and its breathing deepened as the sedative pulled it toward unconsciousness. When Marcus finally arrived, trudging through the deep snow with a backpack of supplies and the industrial bolt cutters strapped to his back, he stopped dead at the edge of the clearing. "Sweet mother of—" he breathed, taking in the scene before him. "You actually did it. You sedated a full-grown black bear." "Not completely," Jack warned. "It's just enough to take the edge off. We don't have much time before it wears off." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The next 2 hours were a blur of focused, desperate activity. Using the bolt cutters, Marcus managed to cut through the metal trap, but removing it from the bear's mangled paw proved far more difficult. The metal teeth had frozen to the bear's flesh, and each careful attempt to separate them caused fresh bleeding. "We need to warm up the metal," Jack decided, pulling out a small camping stove from his pack. With painstaking care, he heated small amounts of water and applied warm compresses to the trap, gradually loosening its grip on the bear's flesh and bone. When the trap finally came free, the damage it revealed was even worse than Jack had feared. The paw was beyond saving. Several bones were crushed, tendons severed, and the infection had spread into the limb. Using his emergency medical kit and the veterinary supplies Elena had instructed Marcus to bring, Jack began the meticulous process of cleaning and treating the wound. "Will it survive with 3 legs?" Marcus asked quietly, holding a flashlight. As the winter sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees. "Bears are adaptable," Jack replied, not looking up from his work. "There have been documented cases of 3-legged bears living full lives in the wild, but first we have to save its life." As Jack worked to clean the wound, administer antibiotics, and bandage what remained of the paw, the bear occasionally stirred, groaning in pain despite the sedative. Each time Jack would pause, speak softly to the animal, and wait until it settled before continuing. Marcus watched in amazement as this seemed to calm the massive predator. "I've been in these woods my whole life," Marcus said, shaking his head in disbelief. "Never seen anything like this. It's like it knows you're helping." By the time they finished, darkness had fallen completely, and the temperature had dropped even further. Jack knew that leaving the bear exposed to the elements would undo all their work. The animal was too weak to survive the night in the open. "We need to create shelter," he said, already scanning the area for possibilities. Together they constructed a makeshift shelter using fallen branches, canvas from Jack's pack, and pine boughs for insulation. They built it around the bear, which had begun to stir more frequently as the sedative wore off. Jack administered a second, smaller dose to keep the animal comfortable through the night. "You're not planning to stay out here with it, are you?" Marcus asked, though he already knew. The answer, "I need to monitor its condition," Jack replied. You should head back before it gets any darker. The storm's picking up again." Marcus hesitated. "This is insane. You know that, right? That thing wakes up cranky, and they'll never find enough of you to bury." Jack smiled tiredly. "Probably, but I can't leave it now." After extracting a promise from Jack to check in via satellite phone every hour, Marcus reluctantly departed, leaving Jack alone with the sedated bear as snow began to fall again, thick flakes swirling in the beam of his headlamp. That night was the longest of Jack's life. He huddled near the entrance of the shelter, close enough to monitor the bear's breathing, but positioned for a quick escape if necessary. Every hour, as promised, he sent Marcus a brief message. "Still alive. Both of us." Between check-ins, Jack dozed fitfully, jerking awake at every sound. The crack of a frost-laden branch, the distant howl of a wolf, the bear's labored breathing. He replaced the bandages twice during the night when blood soaked through, administering more antibiotics and pain medication according to Elena's instructions. By dawn, Jack was exhausted, freezing, and running on nothing but adrenaline and determination. But the bear had survived the night, a victory in itself. As the first grey light filtered through the trees, Jack crawled closer to check the wound. The bleeding had finally stopped, and though infection was still a serious concern, the bear's breathing seemed stronger. What happened next would become the first chapter in a story that Jack would tell countless times over the years that followed, a story that most people dismissed as embellishment or outright fiction until the day its truth would be dramatically proven. As Jack leaned over to examine the bandaged limb, the bear's eyes opened fully for the first time since the previous day. There was no cloudiness of pain or sedative now, just clear, intelligent awareness. Man and bear locked eyes, barely a foot apart, in a moment that stretched beyond seconds into something timeless. Jack had photographed black bears many times before. He had captured images of them fishing for salmon, teaching cubs to climb, even fighting during mating season. He knew their expressions, their body language, the way their eyes typically held nothing but wild instinct when they looked at humans. But what he saw in this bear's gaze was something he had never witnessed before, and something that would haunt him for years to come. Recognition, awareness, and something that, if seen in human eyes, Jack would have called gratitude. The bear made no move to attack, though it was alert enough to do so. Instead, it simply held Jack's gaze for what felt like an eternity before slowly, deliberately closing its eyes again. When Marcus returned with Eleanor later that morning, bringing more medical supplies and a specialized wildlife transport sled, they found Jack sitting in the snow outside the shelter, his expression dazed from more than just exhaustion. "It looked at me," he told them, his voice hoarse, "really looked at me, like it understood." Elena, ever the pragmatist, checked Jack for signs of hypothermia, while Marcus approached the shelter cautiously. "The cold and stress can cause hallucinations," she said gently. "Let's get you both out of here." Getting the bear onto the transport sled was a dangerous operation that required another dose of sedative, and all three of them working together. Once secured, they began the arduous journey back to the logging road where Elena had parked her truck. The plan was to take the bear to a wildlife rehabilitation facility in eastern Washington, one of the few equipped to handle such severe injuries. Word of Jack's unconventional rescue spread through Pinecrest before he even returned to town. By evening, as he sat in the local diner with his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee so hot it burned his still numb fingers, he had already heard every possible opinion on his actions. "Brave as hell," said some, clapping him on the shoulder as they passed his booth. "Dumb luck you're not dead," said others, shaking their heads in disbelief. "Waste of time," said the more cynical. "That bear won't last a month in the wild with 3 legs. Should have let nature take its course." But the comment that stayed with Jack came from old Hal Jensen, an 80-year-old former forest ranger who had lived in the Cascades his entire life. Hal lowered himself painfully into the seat across from Jack, fixed him with a weathered gaze, and said, "My father told me a story once when I was just a boy, about a wounded grizzly he helped back in '47. Said 3 years later that same bear crossed his path during a blizzard, looked him right in the eye, and walked away when it could have killed him easy. Most folks called it nonsense." The old man paused, studying Jack's face. "But I saw your eyes when you came out of those woods today. You saw something out there, didn't you? Something you can't quite explain." Jack nodded slowly. "I did." Hal leaned forward. "Bears have longer memories than people give them credit for, and they're smarter than most want to admit. My advice, don't be surprised if your paths cross again someday." In the weeks that followed, Jack received regular updates from the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. Against all odds, the bear was recovering. They had been forced to amputate what remained of the injured paw, but the infection was under control, and the bear, a 5-year-old male they estimated to weigh close to 400 pounds, was adapting remarkably well to moving on 3 legs. "He's stronger than we expected," the lead veterinarian told Jack during one phone call. "Black bears are incredibly resilient. We've seen cases where they've adapted to far worse injuries in the wild." "Will he be released?" Jack asked, the question that had been weighing on him. "That's the plan eventually. We want to make sure he's fully recovered and can forage effectively. But given his progress, I'd say he has a good chance at returning to the wild by late spring or early summer." Throughout the bear's rehabilitation, Jack made the 4-hour drive to the facility several times. The staff found his interest unusual, but touching. They allowed him to observe the bear, now officially named Trapper in their records, though Jack privately thought of him as Survivor, from a safe distance during feeding times. Each visit confirmed what Jack had seen that day in the forest. This wasn't just any bear. There was an unusual intelligence in those eyes, a presence that seemed to observe and consider in a way that went beyond basic animal instinct. And though the staff laughed it off, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that the bear recognized him, tracking his movements specifically when he was present in a way it didn't do with other observers. 6 months after the rescue, on a warm June morning, Jack received the call he had been both anticipating and dreading. Survivor was ready for release. He would be returned to the wild in a remote area of the Cascade Range, about 20 miles from where he had been found, far enough from human settlements to minimize conflict, but still within his likely home range. "We usually don't allow civilians at releases," the rehabilitation director told him, "but given your role in saving him, we're making an exception. If you want to be there, that is." Jack didn't hesitate. "I'll be there." The release took place at dawn. A team of wildlife biologists, the veterinarians who had overseen the bear's recovery, and Jack gathered in a mountain meadow surrounded by dense forest. The bear was transported in a specially designed crate, sedated for the journey, but beginning to wake as they prepared for the release. Dr. Miyako Tanaka, the lead biologist, explained the procedure to Jack as her team made final preparations. We've fitted him with a tracking collar so we can monitor his movements and adaptation. It's designed to eventually break away, but it will give us valuable data on how three-legged bears navigate their environment. Jack nodded, his attention fixed on the crate where occasional deep grunts indicated the bear was regaining consciousness. "He's got good odds," Dr. Tanaka continued, perhaps sensing Jack's concern. "The territory we're releasing him into has abundant food sources and few competing males. His biggest challenge will be hibernation preparation, but we've seen amputee bears successfully den and emerge in the spring." When the moment came to open the crate, everyone retreated to a safe distance except for the two handlers controlling the remote release mechanism. Jack stood with the others at the edge of the meadow, his camera ready, though he doubted he would use it. Some moments weren't meant to be photographed. The crate door swung open. Seconds passed, 10, 20, 30, with no movement. Then, slowly, a massive black head emerged, nose working furiously to process the sense of freedom. The bear stepped out cautiously, its movement altered but still powerful as it adjusted to the three-legged gait that had become its new normal. It stood in the morning sunlight, steam rising from its dark fur in the cool air, and surveyed its surroundings. When its gaze reached the humans, it paused, seeming to study them one by one. When those eyes found Jack, they stopped. Even at this distance, Jack felt it. The same connection, the same strange moment of recognition that he had experienced in the snow-covered clearing 6 months earlier. The bear held his gaze for several heartbeats, long enough that Dr. Tanaka whispered, "That's unusual behavior." Then, with surprising grace for such a large animal with an amputation, the bear turned and moved toward the forest edge. At the tree line, it paused once more, looked back, directly at Jack, he was certain, and then disappeared into the shadows beneath the ancient conifers. "Remarkable," Dr. Tanaka said, making notes on her tablet. "Most bears bolt immediately. Upon release, he showed unusual confidence and awareness." "He's special," Jack said simply. "The tracking data will be fascinating," she replied. "We'll be able to see how quickly he adapts, his movement patterns, foraging success. I can send you updates if you're interested." "Please," Jack said, still staring at the spot where the bear had vanished, unable to shake the feeling that this story was far from over. "I'd like to know how he does." As Jack drove the winding mountain roads back to Pinecrest that afternoon, he couldn't help but feel that he had just witnessed not an ending, but a beginning. Old Hal's words echoed in his mind. "Don't be surprised if your paths cross again someday." Little did Jack know then just how prophetic those words would prove to be, or that 3 years later, on another winter morning, Survivor would return, in a way that would leave everyone who witnessed it questioning everything they thought they knew about the limitations of animal memory, emotion, and intelligence. The most extraordinary chapter of this remarkable story was yet to be written, a chapter that would begin with a bear emerging from the forest on a snowy December morning, carrying something that no one could explain. But for now, as summer turned to fall and fall to winter, life in Pinecrest returned to normal. Jack went back to his photography, though he found himself increasingly drawn to documenting the secret lives of black bears specifically. His images of bears foraging, Climbing, swimming, and caring for cubs won awards and were featured in national wildlife magazines. Yet none of these bears, no matter how magnificent, held the same fascination for Jack as the three-legged male he had saved and then set free. As the first anniversary of the rescue approached, Jack often found himself wondering about Survivor. The tracking data showed the bear had established a territory spanning about 15 square miles, centered around a series of remote valleys rich in berry patches, salmon streams, and the occasional beehive. Despite his disability, he was thriving, as a testament to the remarkable adaptability of these often misunderstood creatures. He's actually covering more ground than some four-legged males in similar habitats, Dr. Tanaka told Jack during one of their periodic phone calls. We're seeing compensatory muscle development in his remaining limbs. It's quite impressive. What the tracking data couldn't tell them, however, was whether Survivor remembered the human who had saved his life that day in the snowy forest. Whether someday, somehow, their paths might cross again. Whether wild animals truly could understand and remember acts of kindness in the way humans hoped they might, that answer would come, but not for another 2 years. And when it did, it would forever change, not just Jack's understanding of these powerful creatures, but the understanding of everyone who heard the remarkable story of the bear who never forgot. Life in Pinecrest shifted subtly after Jack's encounter with the bear. Those who had initially called him reckless gradually became curious, especially as updates from the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center continued to report the bear's remarkable progress. Jack found himself becoming something of a reluctant local celebrity, with tourists occasionally stopping him on the street after recognizing him from a feature article in Northwest Outdoor magazine titled "The Surgeon Who Saved a Bear." The attention made Jack uncomfortable. He hadn't rescued the bear for recognition or praise. He'd done it because, faced with suffering, his instinct was to heal. That instinct had driven his medical career and now shaped his life as a wildlife photographer. Through his lens, he sought to capture not just the beauty of wild creatures, but their individuality, their intelligence, their right to exist unharmed by human interference. During the first year after the bear's release, Jack's photography took on a new dimension. His images became more intimate, more revealing of animal consciousness. One photograph in particular, of a mother black bear teaching her cubs to fish, won the prestigious National Wildlife Federation's annual competition. The judges called it a rare window into the intentional teaching behaviors of bears that few photographers have managed to document. Jack knew the recognition came partly from his newfound patience. Since his encounter with Survivor, he could sit for hours, sometimes days, waiting for the perfect moment that revealed something deeper about animal lives. It was as if his experience in the snowy clearing had opened a channel of understanding that informed his work. "You've changed," Elena remarked one evening as they sat on the porch of his cabin, watching the sunset paint the distant peaks with gold. "Your photographs have always been technically perfect, but now they show something more." Jack sipped his coffee, considering her words. "I see them differently now," he admitted. "Not just as subjects, but as beings with their own stories." Elena smiled. "And your own story continues to spread. Did you know they're using what happened with you and that bear as a case study at the University of Washington's wildlife biology program?" Jack grimaced. "God, why? I broke every rule in the book." "Because it worked," Elena said simply. And because it raises interesting questions about animal cognition and memory, that bear looked at you differently than it should have, Jack. We both saw it. The tracking data from Survivor's Collar continued to provide fascinating insights over the months that followed. The bear had established a stable territory, was successfully foraging despite his missing limb, and had even been observed by field researchers climbing trees, a remarkable achievement for a three-legged bear. His adaptation is extraordinary, Dr. Tanaka told Jack during one of their regular updates. We're seeing compensatory muscle development in his remaining limbs. His right shoulder especially has developed muscle mass well beyond what we typically observe. Is he interacting with other bears? Jack asked, always curious about Survivor's social behavior. Limited interactions, mostly avoidance of larger males, which is to be expected. He seems to have adjusted his behavior to minimize conflict. He's smarter than average, I'd say, choosing his battles carefully. As fascinating as these updates were, they couldn't answer the question that lingered in Jack's mind. Did Survivor remember him? Did that moment of connection in the snow mean anything, or was it just the projection of a human mind, desperate to find meaning in the indifferent eyes of nature? 18 months after the bear's release, Jack got his first hint of an answer. He had been photographing salmon runs in a remote stream about 12 miles from town, within Survivor's known territory, though Jack hadn't explicitly gone looking for the bear. Setting up before dawn, he had positioned himself in a blind near the water's edge, camera ready to capture the silver flashes of fish fighting their way upstream. The soft light of early morning revealed a landscape painted in mist. Jack's breath fogged in the cool air as he waited, perfectly still, for the wildlife that would come to feed on the salmon. First arrived a pair of eagles, majestic in their precision as they plucked fish from the rushing water. Then a family of otters, playful even in their hunting. Jack's shutter clicked quietly, capturing it all. It was nearly noon when he sensed, rather than heard, a presence behind his blind. A prickling awareness raised the hair on his arms. Slowly, carefully, he turned his head to look through the small viewing port he had left in the rear of the blind. There, not 20 yards away at the forest edge, stood a black bear. Even at this distance, Jack could see it was missing its right front paw. Survivor. The bear stood motionless, its nose working the air currents, clearly aware of Jack's presence in the blind. For a tense moment, Jack wondered if he should be concerned. Even without the missing paw, the bear had grown since their last encounter. He now estimated its weight at over 500 pounds, a formidable predator by any measure. But fear wasn't what Jack felt as he watched the bear through the viewing port. Instead, he felt a strange sense of recognition, almost like encountering an old friend unexpectedly. Time seemed suspended as the bear continued to stare directly at the blind, its eyes focused with unmistakable intent. Then, with deliberate movements that seemed too calculated to be coincidence, the bear lowered itself to the stream's edge. Rather than fishing in the manner typical of black bears, wading in and swiping at salmon with powerful paws, it adapted its technique to its disability, using its remaining front paw to stabilize itself on a rock. It waited with extraordinary patience until a salmon came within reach of its jaws, then struck with lightning precision. What happened next convinced Jack that this was no random encounter. After catching the fish, instead of retreating into the forest to eat in safety as bears typically do, Survivor carried his prize to a flat rock about 15 yards from Jack's. Blind, close enough for a perfect photograph, yet maintaining a respectful distance. There, the bear proceeded to eat, occasionally looking directly toward the blind, as if making sure Jack was watching. Jack's hands trembled slightly as he raised his camera and began shooting. The light was perfect, the composition immaculate. But what made these images extraordinary was the subject's apparent awareness of the photographer. In frame after frame, the bear's eyes connected directly with the lens in a way Jack had never captured before. For nearly an hour, this strange tableau continued. The bear caught 3 salmon, eating each on the same flat rock, always with those occasional glances toward Jack that seemed too intentional to be coincidence. Then, as the light began to shift toward afternoon, Survivor rose, looked one final time toward the blind, and disappeared into the forest with the same deliberate grace Jack remembered from the release. That night, reviewing the images on his computer, Jack felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening's dropping temperature. The photographs showed something that defied conventional understanding of bear behavior. It wasn't just that Survivor had tolerated a human presence nearby. Many bears in areas with regular human activity learned such tolerance. It was the quality of attention in those eyes, the direct gaze, the sustained focus, the awareness that seemed to say, "I know you're there and I remember you." Jack sent the best images to Dr. Tanaka with a simple question: "Is this normal behavior?" Her response came the next morning: "Absolutely not. This is extraordinary." The positioning, the repeated returns to the same spot, the direct eye contact, this suggests recognition and intentionality well beyond what we typically observe. May I share these with my colleagues at the university? Encouraged by her interest, Jack wrote a detailed account of the encounter to accompany the photos. Within weeks, his images and story had sparked debate among wildlife biologists. Some argued that Jack was anthropomorphizing, projecting human qualities onto animal behavior. Others suggested that the bear's behavior indicated a level of recognition and spatial memory that deserved serious scientific consideration. "Bears are intelligent animals," wrote Dr. Kimberly Chen, a cognitive ethologist at the University of British Columbia, in response to Jack's documentation. "They can remember food sources from year to year, recognize other individual bears, and adapt to changing environments. But if Mr. Thornton's account is accurate, this particular bear's behavior suggests something we rarely have the opportunity to observe: the possibility of cross-species recognition and perhaps even a form of gratitude." The academic debate mattered little to Jack compared to the personal meaning of the encounter. For him, it was confirmation of what he had felt in that snowy clearing 2 winters ago, that something had passed between him and the bear, something that transcended the usual boundaries between human and wild animal. Over the next year, Jack had 2 more similar encounters with Survivor, each time while photographing in different parts of the bear's territory. Each followed the same pattern. The bear would appear, acknowledge Jack's presence, go about its natural behaviors in a way that allowed for optimal photography, then depart with what seemed like deliberate awareness. Word of these encounters spread through both the local community and the wildlife photography world. Some dismissed them as coincidence or fabrication. Others, particularly those who had spent their lives observing wild animals, found them more plausible. "Animals know more than we give them credit for," old Hal told Jack during one of their regular chess games at the Pinecrest diner. "My grandfather used to leave food for a family of foxes during a particularly harsh winter back in the 30s. Years later, one of those foxes, or its offspring, hard to know for sure, led him to a broken trap where another fox was caught. Grandad always said that fox remembered his kindness and trusted him to help again." "Did people believe him?" Jack asked, moving his bishop across the board. Hal chuckled, capturing Jack's piece with a weathered hand. "Some did, some didn't. Doesn't much matter, does it? He knew what happened, just like you know what's happening with your bear." As the second anniversary of the rescue approached, Jack found himself thinking more and more about Survivor. The bear's tracking collar had eventually fallen off as designed, meaning Dr. Tanaka's team no longer received regular data on his movements. Field researchers still occasionally reported sightings, all indicating that the bear continued to thrive despite his disability. Jack had been careful not to seek Survivor out directly. Their encounters had all occurred naturally while he was photographing other wildlife. He felt strongly that initiating contact would somehow violate the trust that had developed between them, crossing a boundary that should remain respected. But as winter settled over the Cascades once more, Jack couldn't help but wonder if their paths would cross again. Each time he ventured into the forest with his camera, part of him was alert for that familiar presence. Yet as the weeks passed and the anniversary date came and went, there was no sign of the bear. "He's probably denning for the winter," Elena reassured him when Jack mentioned his disappointment. "Bears are creatures of season and instinct, after all." Jack nodded, knowing she was right. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to his connection with Survivor than could be explained by science or reason, something that went beyond instinct and entered the realm of relationship. That feeling would be vindicated in a way that none of them could have anticipated when spring arrived, bringing with it circumstances that would test both Jack's courage and Survivor's memory in ways that would leave the entire town of Pinecrest in awe. The changing season brought with it an unexpected development. A logging company had purchased rights to harvest timber in a valley that overlapped with part of Survivor's territory. While logging was common in parts of the national forest, this particular area had been protected under an agreement that was now expiring. Concerned about the impact on wildlife, Jack joined a coalition of local environmentalists and business owners who argued that the area's greater value lay in preservation, not timber. The resulting conflict divided the town, with jobs and economic benefits weighed against environmental concerns. As the dispute intensified, Jack found himself in the uncomfortable position of spokesperson for the preservation effort. His photographs of the valley's wildlife, including several striking images of Survivor, became symbols in the campaign to protect the forest. "I didn't set out to become an activist," he told Elena as they posted flyers announcing a town meeting. "I just want to protect his home." Elena gave him a knowing look. "This is about more than one bear, Jack." "Of course it is," he agreed quickly. "It's about the entire ecosystem, all the wildlife." "No," she interrupted gently. "I mean, it's about more than protecting wildlife. This is personal for you. That bear changed something in you, and now you're fighting for him specifically. It's okay to admit that." Jack was silent for a moment, considering her words. "Maybe you're right," he finally conceded. "But does that make the cause any less worthy?" The town meeting was scheduled for early April in the high school gymnasium. Representatives from the logging company would present their plans, followed by the Preservation Coalition's counter-argument. As the day approached, tensions in Pinecrest rose. Signs appeared in shop windows and front yards, some supporting jobs and industry, others declaring, "Save our forest." The night before the meeting, Jack sat on his cabin porch reviewing his presentation. The spring air carried the scent of pine and warming earth. In the distance, the mountains stood silhouetted against a sky streaked with the last colors of sunset. Jack had just gathered his papers when he heard it, a sound from the forest edge that made him freeze. A deep, resonant woofing, the unmistakable vocalization of a black bear. Heart-pounding, he slowly turned toward the trees that bordered his property. There, partially obscured by shadow, stood Survivor. Even in the dim light, Jack had no doubt it was him, the distinctive, three-legged, yet as he moved slightly forward, the massive shoulders, the intelligent eyes reflecting the porch light. "Hey, big guy," Jack said softly, remaining seated to appear less threatening. "Been a while." The bear stood at the forest edge, about 50 yards from the porch, watching. Jack had never seen Survivor this close to human habitation before. All their previous encounters had been deep in the wilderness, far from town. Yet here he was, deliberately approaching Jack's home. For nearly 10 minutes, they remained in this tableau. Jack sitting motionless on the porch, Survivor standing. At the tree line, there was no fear in this moment, only a strange sense of communion that transcended words. Then, with the same deliberate movement Jack had come to recognize, the bear turned and melted back into the forest. Jack sat for a long time after Survivor, disappeared, wondering at the timing of this visit. Was it merely coincidence that the bear had appeared the night before the meeting that would decide the fate of his territory? Or was there something more at work? Some deeper awareness that Jack still struggled to comprehend. The town meeting the next day was contentious from the start. The gymnasium was packed with residents, loggers, environmentalists, and media. Jack found himself scanning the crowd, noting the divisions visible, even in how people chose their seats. Those supporting the logging operation on one side, preservation advocates on the other. The logging company representatives spoke first, outlining their plans for sustainable harvest and emphasizing the jobs and economic benefits their operation would bring to Pinecrest. Their presentation was professional, matter-of-fact, bolstered by charts showing projected revenue and employment figures. When it was Jack's turn to speak, he abandoned his prepared notes. Instead, he connected his laptop to the projector and let his photographs speak for him. Images of the valley in different seasons, its diverse wildlife, and finally, a series of shots of Survivor fishing in the stream that ran through the disputed territory. "This bear should have died 3 years ago," Jack said quietly, his voice carrying in the suddenly hushed gymnasium. "By all conventional wisdom, a black bear with a severe injury, trapped in sub-zero temperatures, should not have survived. But he did, because he's extraordinary, just as this valley is extraordinary." Jack clicked to the next slide, his most powerful image of Survivor looking directly into the camera. "We talk about economic value, about resources, about what we can take from the land. But there's another kind of value that's harder to measure, the value of a place where wild creatures can live as they were meant to live. The value of knowing that some things remain untouched by our endless need to harvest and profit." As Jack continued speaking, sharing the story of the rescue and the remarkable encounters that followed, he became aware of a commotion at the back of the gymnasium. People were standing, pointing toward the windows. A murmur spread through the crowd, growing louder until it drowned out his words. Jack stopped mid-sentence, turning to follow everyone's gaze. Through the high windows that lined the gymnasium wall, he saw people running across the school parking lot. Something was happening outside. Marcus pushed through the crowd toward him. "Jack," he said urgently, "you need to come, now." "What's going on?" Jack asked, already moving to follow. Marcus just shook his head. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you. Just come see." They hurried outside, followed by much of the crowd from the meeting. In the school's side yard, at the edge of the playing field where it met the forest, a cluster of people stood at a cautious distance from something Jack couldn't yet see. As the crowd parted to let him through, Jack felt the world tilt beneath his feet. There, standing motionless at the very edge of the trees, was Survivor. The bear was fully exposed in the daylight, making no attempt to hide his presence, his eyes scanning the crowd until they found Jack. Gasps and exclamations rippled through the onlookers. Some retreated in fear, while others raised phones to record the unprecedented sight of a wild black bear deliberately approaching the town in broad daylight. "Nobody move," called Tom Patterson, the local wildlife officer who had been attending the meeting. "Stay calm and still." But Jack was already moving forward, ignoring Tom's instructions, walking slowly toward the bear, with a certainty that defied explanation. He stopped about 30 feet from Survivor, close enough to see the healed scar tissue around his missing paw, the intelligence in those dark eyes. "It's the bear from your pictures," someone whispered behind him, "the three-legged one." For a long moment, bear and man regarded each other across the open space, two beings connected by a shared experience that had changed them both. Then, with deliberate movements, Survivor turned slightly and looked back toward the forest. Then, back at Jack, then toward the forest again. "He wants you to follow him," said old Hal, who had appeared at Jack's side. "Clear as day." "That's ridiculous," Tom protested. "Bears don't—" "Hush, boy," Hal interrupted. "You're witnessing something most folks never see in a lifetime in these mountains. The question is," he turned to Jack, "are you going to follow?" Every logical part of Jack's mind told him that following a wild bear into the forest was insane, a violation of every safety protocol, potentially suicidal. Yet something deeper than logic, something that had begun in that snowy clearing 3 years ago, compelled him forward. "I'm going," he said quietly, "but no one else. It's not safe for a group." "I'm coming with you," Tom insisted, checking his tranquilizer gun. "As wildlife officer, I can't let you put that away," Jack said firmly. "If you come unarmed, or you don't come at all. He's not a threat." The standoff lasted only seconds before Tom reluctantly secured his weapon in his vehicle. "This is against every protocol," he muttered. "Sometimes protocols don't account for exceptions," Jack replied, already moving toward the forest edge where Survivor waited, watching them with what Jack could only describe as impatience. As they approached, the bear turned and began moving into the trees, stopping every few yards to look back, clearly checking that they were following. The behavior was so unlike anything Tom had seen in his 20 years as a wildlife officer that he fell silent, his skepticism giving way to wonder. They followed Survivor for nearly a mile, deeper into the forest, moving away from town toward the disputed valley. The bear set a pace that acknowledged his followers' limitations, choosing a route that, while challenging, remained passable for humans. "He's heading toward Miller's Creek," Tom observed, as they crossed a familiar ridge. "That's right in the center of the proposed logging area," Jack nodded, saving his breath for the hike. The creek was a vital water source in the disputed territory, its banks home to an unusually diverse range of wildlife. He had photographed there many times, including several of his encounters with Survivor. When they finally reached the creek, the reason for their journey became immediately apparent. On the far bank, tangled in abandoned fishing line and barely moving, was a young bear cub. Survivor stopped at the water's edge, looking from the cub to Jack and back again. The message, in his behavior unmistakable even to the skeptical Tom. "My God," the wildlife officer breathed. "He brought us here deliberately. He's asking for help." The cub was small, probably born just months earlier during hibernation. As they watched, it struggled weakly against the fishing line, which had wrapped around its neck and one leg, binding it to a fallen log. Without intervention, the cub would either strangle itself in its struggles or die of dehydration. "We need to help it," Jack said, already removing his jacket and assessing the safest way to cross the creek. "Wait," Tom cautioned, scanning the surroundings. "Where's the mother? A female with cubs is the most dangerous bear encounter possible." She's probably dead," Jack replied grimly. "Otherwise she'd be here trying to free it, and he wouldn't have brought us here." He gestured toward Survivor, who had settled onto his haunches at the creek's edge, watching them with that same intentional focus Jack had come to recognize. He showed no signs of aggression, only a patience that seemed to say, "I've brought you here, now do what you do." With Tom's reluctant assistance, Jack crossed the creek and carefully approached the trapped cub. The young bear growled feebly, but was too exhausted to put up much resistance. Using a pocket knife, Jack carefully cut away the fishing line, taking care not to cause further injury to the already abraded skin beneath. "The line's embedded in places," he told Tom, who had waded across to help. "We need to get it to a vet. It might need antibiotics." Throughout the rescue, Survivor remained where he was, watching from across the creek, his behavior defying everything Tom had been taught about black bears, particularly adult males, who were known to kill cubs rather than protect them. Once freed, the cub was too weak to flee or resist as Jack carefully lifted it. They recrossed the creek, bringing the injured cub to the same bank where Survivor waited. Jack expected the adult bear to retreat as they approached with the cub, maintaining a defensive distance. Instead, Survivor rose and moved toward them, stopping just feet away. The behavior was so unexpected that even Jack felt a moment of alarm. But the bear made no aggressive move. He simply sniffed the air in the direction of the cub, then looked at Jack with what could only be described as expectation. "He wants to make sure it's okay," Jack said softly, still cradling the weakened cub. "This goes against everything we know about male bears, Tom." The wildlife officer could only nod, his professional understanding of bear behavior utterly inadequate to explain what he was witnessing. "We need to get that cub to Elena," he finally said. "Then we need to come back here with a team. If this area is home to orphaned cubs, that changes the environmental impact assessment significantly." As they prepared to carry the cub back to town, Jack turned to Survivor once more. "Thank you," he said simply, knowing how strange the words might sound to Tom, but feeling they needed to be spoken. "Thank you for trusting us." The bear held his gaze for a long moment, then turned and moved away through the trees, not fleeing, but departing now that his purpose had been accomplished. Jack watched until the dark shape disappeared among the shadows of the forest. The return journey to Pinecrest took longer with the injured cub. By the time they emerged from the forest, a crowd had gathered at the edge of town, alerted by those who had witnessed the earlier events. Among them were journalists, environmentalists, and the logging company representatives, all waiting to hear what had happened in the forest. The sight of Jack and Tom carrying a bear cub created an immediate stir. As Elena rushed forward to take the injured animal, questions erupted from all sides. What had happened? Why had the bear led them into the forest? Was this a publicity stunt for the anti-logging campaign? Jack let Tom handle the immediate explanations while he helped Elena get the cub to her clinic. Only later, after ensuring the young bear was receiving proper care, did he return to address the town and the media that had descended upon Pinecrest. Standing on the steps of the town hall, Jack found himself at the center of a story far beyond anything he could have imagined when he first found a dying bear in the snow 3 years earlier. Camera crews from regional and even national networks pointed their lenses at him as he spoke. What happened today defies simple explanation. He began, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd. A wild bear, one that I helped save years ago, deliberately sought human assistance for an orphaned cub. Scientists will debate what this means about animal cognition and behavior, but for those of us who witnessed it, the meaning is clear. He paused, looking out at the faces before him. Loggers, environmentalists, townspeople, journalists, all united in their astonishment at the day's events. We share this world with beings whose intelligence and emotional lives we've only begun to understand. Today, a bear remembered an act of kindness from years ago and trusted us enough to seek our help again. If that doesn't change how we see our responsibility to the wild places and creatures around us, I don't know what could. That evening, as video of Survivor and the story of the rescued cub spread across social media and news outlets, the logging company announced they would be reassessing their plans in light of new wildlife conservation concerns. It wasn't a definitive victory, but it was a beginning, a pause that might yet grow into permanent protection. Jack sat on his porch once more, watching the forest as darkness fell. The day's events had left him drained yet exhilarated, his understanding of his connection with Survivor forever altered. What had begun as a chance encounter in a snowy clearing had evolved into something profound, a relationship that crossed the boundaries between species, a trust that had saved not one life, but two. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Jack thought about the journey ahead. The cub would need weeks of rehabilitation before it could be released. The fate of the disputed valley remained uncertain. And somewhere in the forest, a three-legged black bear continued his solitary existence, his life intertwined with Jack's in ways that neither science nor logic could fully explain. Yet one thing was certain. In a world that often seemed determined to separate humans from the natural world, to draw clear lines between people and wild animals, Survivor had crossed those lines. In doing so, he had reminded everyone who heard his story that compassion creates connections that endure, and that kindness, once given, may return when we least expect it, but need it most. The morning after Jack and Tom returned with the rescued, Cub, Pinecrest awakened to find itself at the center of a media storm. News vans lined the main street, reporters conducted interviews on sidewalks, and the local diner had never served so many breakfasts. The story of a wild bear seeking human help to save an orphaned cub had struck a chord that resonated far beyond the small mountain town. Jack avoided the cameras as much as possible, retreating to Elena's veterinary clinic, where the rescued cub was recovering. The young bear, a female they estimated to be about 4 months old, was responding well to treatment. The fishing line had cut deeply into her neck and front leg, but Elena's skilled care was already showing results. "She's quite remarkable," Eleanor said, as they observed the cub from the monitoring area adjacent to her recovery enclosure. "Most cubs this age would be frantic in captivity, but she's surprisingly calm." Jack watched the young bear through the observation window. Despite her injuries, there was an alertness in her eyes that reminded him of Survivor. "Have you thought about what happens next? She's too young to release." Elena nodded, making notes on the cub's chart. "She'll need rehabilitation, probably. For at least a year. I've already spoken with the wildlife center that handled Survivor. They have space for her and experience with orphaned cubs." "Does she have a name yet?" Jack asked, knowing that naming wild animals was discouraged, but sometimes inevitable. Elena smiled slightly. "Officially, she's just Female Cub 23-7, but the staff have started calling her Messenger." "Messenger," Jack repeated, testing the name, "because she was the message." "Exactly." Elena turned to face him directly. "Jack, I've treated wildlife for 15 years. I've seen countless bears, and I've never observed behavior like what you and Tom described. An adult male black bear should have no interest in saving an unrelated cub. If anything, male bears are known to kill cubs. What Survivor did goes against everything we understand about bear behavior." Jack had been pondering this same contradiction since yesterday's events. "Maybe what we understand is incomplete," he suggested. "Or maybe he's an exception." "Either way," Elena replied, "he's changed how a lot of people think about these animals. The logging company representatives came by this morning while you were sleeping." This caught Jack's attention. "What did they want?" "To see the cub, and to tell me they're suspending their plans pending a new environmental assessment. Apparently, the evidence of orphaned cubs in the area requires additional study before they can proceed." Jack felt a surge of hope. It wasn't a permanent victory, but it was a reprieve, time to build a stronger case for preserving the valley. "That's unexpected good news." "It's more than that," Elena said, her expression serious. "It's an opportunity. They're actually listening now, Jack. After yesterday, they have to. A bear leading humans to save a cub makes for bad publicity if they then clear-cut its habitat." By mid-afternoon, the story had spread beyond regional news to national networks. Footage of Survivor at the forest edge, taken by bystanders on their phones, played on stations across the country. Wildlife experts offered theories on morning shows, and social media erupted with hashtags like Jul Bear Hero and Jung the Bear Whisper. Jack's phone rang constantly with interview requests, which he largely declined. But when Dr. Tanaka called, he answered immediately. "I've just seen the news," she said without preamble. "Is it accurate? Did he actually lead you to the cub?" "Yes," Jack replied simply. "Tom Patterson was with me the entire time. He's the local wildlife officer and about as skeptical As they come, even he couldn't explain it. There was a long silence before Dr. Tanaka spoke again. This could change our understanding of bear cognition and social behavior. I'd like to come there, Jack. See the location, interview you and Tom formally, review any footage. Of course, Jack agreed. I'll help however I can. Dr. Tanaka arrived 3 days later with a small team of researchers from the university. By then, Messenger had been transferred to the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, and the media frenzy had begun to subside, though Pinecrest remained busier than usual with curious visitors hoping to glimpse the famous three-legged bear. Jack led the research team to Miller's Creek, retracing the exact route Survivor had taken. Tom joined them, along with Marcus and a Forest Service biologist. At the creek, they documented everything: the location where the cub had been trapped, the spot where Survivor had waited, the path they had all taken through the forest. The most remarkable aspect, Dr. Tanaka said as they gathered data, is the apparent intentionality. Based on your descriptions, this wasn't just a bear that tolerated human presence or displayed unusual curiosity. This was an animal that deliberately sought human assistance for a specific purpose. He knew exactly what he was doing, Tom confirmed, still sounding slightly amazed by his own account. I've worked with wildlife for 20 years, and I've never seen anything that comes close to this level of, I don't even know what to call it, problem-solving, communication. Over the next few weeks, as summer reached its peak in the Cascade Mountains, Jack found himself straddling multiple roles: photographer, reluctant local celebrity, informal consultant to the research team, and advocate for the forest preservation campaign. The latter had gained significant momentum following the Messenger incident, as it was now being called in scientific circles. One afternoon, as Jack was reviewing photographs in his cabin, a knock at the door revealed old Hal, who rarely left town these days due to his arthritis. "Thought I'd bring you some news," the old man said, easing himself into a chair on Jack's porch. "Logging company called a town meeting for next week. Word is they're going to announce a permanent withdrawal from the valley." Jack nearly dropped his camera. "Seriously? That would be incredible." Hal nodded, his weathered face creasing into a smile. "Amazing what one bear can accomplish, isn't it? Though I suspect having half the country watching had something to do with their change of heart. Bad publicity costs more than timber these days." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching a pair of ravens circle above the trees. "You know," Hal finally said, "my grandfather used to say that animals choose certain people, pick them out somehow. Said they could sense something in a person that most humans couldn't see in each other. I always thought it was just one of his stories." He fixed Jack with a penetrating gaze. Not so sure anymore. The thought had occurred to Jack as well, though he hesitated to voice it aloud, especially to the scientist studying the case. Why had Survivor sought him out specifically? Why trust him, of all people, with saving the cub? "I was just in the right place at the right time," Jack said, not entirely convinced of his own explanation. Hal chuckled softly. "Maybe. Or maybe there's something in you that Bear recognized, something worth trusting." The town meeting the following week confirmed the rumors. The logging company announced they were permanently donating their rights to the disputed valley to a conservation trust in exchange for tax benefits and access to less contentious timberlands elsewhere in the state. The decision was met with applause from most of Pinecrest residents, even some who had initially supported the logging operation. "It's a win-win," the company spokesman explained. "The recent events highlighted the unique wildlife value of this particular area. We're committed to sustainable forestry practices, and sometimes that means recognizing when a forest has greater value intact." Jack sat at the back of the town hall, feeling a complex mixture of emotions: relief for the protection of survivors' territory, gratitude toward the company for making the right decision, and a profound sense of wonder at the chain of events that had led to this moment. It had begun with a simple act of compassion in a snowy clearing and culminated in the preservation of an entire valley. As summer gave way to autumn, Jack's life gradually returned to something resembling normal. Dr. Tanaka's team concluded their field research, though the analysis and publication of their findings would continue for months. The media attention dwindled to occasional follow-up stories and requests for Jack to speak at conservation events, which he largely declined. Instead, he returned to what he loved most, venturing into the wilderness with his camera, documenting the changing seasons and the creatures that called these mountains home. Yet something had shifted in his approach to this work, something even more profound than the changes that had followed his initial rescue of Survivor. Jack found himself photographing with a new awareness of the inner lives of his subjects. The family dynamics of wolf packs, the playfulness of river otters, the apparent mourning behavior of a doe who had lost her fawn to predators. His images began to tell stories that went beyond beautiful composition or perfect lighting, capturing moments of animal consciousness that many had previously dismissed as anthropomorphic fantasy. "You've developed a different eye," Marcus observed, when Jack showed him a new series of images. "These photographs, they feel like portraits, like you're showing us who these animals are, not just what they look like." Jack nodded, understanding exactly what his friend meant. "I think I'm finally seeing them clearly, or maybe they're finally letting me see." As the days grew shorter and the first snow dusted the peaks, Jack found himself thinking more about Survivor. There had been no confirmed sightings of the bear since the day he had led them to Messenger. The research team had set up camera traps throughout his known territory, but the elusive bear had avoided them all, a fact that Dr. Tanaka found both frustrating and fascinating. "He shows remarkable awareness of human observation equipment," she noted in their last conversation. "Almost as if he understands what the cameras are for and deliberately stays out of their field of view." Jack wasn't surprised. He had come to understand that there was something exceptional about this particular bear, an intelligence that defied easy categorization or study. In his more philosophical moments, Jack wondered if their connection represented something older and deeper than modern science could readily explain, a reminder of a time when humans and animals shared a more intimate understanding. One crisp November morning, with winter settling in earnest over the mountains, Jack hiked to a remote ridgeline that offered sweeping views of the now protected valley. The forest spread below him in a tapestry of evergreen, the creek a silver thread winding through bare, deciduous trees. Soon the bears would be entering hibernation, seeking their dens for the long sleep of winter. Jack set up his tripod and began photographing the landscape, capturing the interplay of light and shadow. Across the valley floor, he was so absorbed in his work that he almost missed the subtle sound behind him, a soft shuffling that didn't match the wind in the trees or the movement of smaller wildlife. An awareness prickled at the back of his neck, a now familiar sensation that made him slowly lower his camera and turn. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood Survivor. The bear had grown even larger since Jack had last seen him, his coat thick and glossy in preparation for winter. The missing front paw was less noticeable now, as he had fully adapted to moving on 3 legs. But the eyes were unchanged, that same intelligent gaze that seemed to see beyond the surface. "Hey, old friend," Jack said softly, remaining still beside his tripod. The bear watched him for a long moment, then deliberately sat on his haunches, a position that spoke of comfort and lack of threat. Jack slowly reached for his camera, moving with exaggerated care, and began to photograph this unexpected encounter. For nearly 20 minutes they remained in this tableau, Jack photographing, Survivor watching, neither encroaching on the other's space. There was a peacefulness to the encounter that defied conventional understanding of human-predator interactions. No fear, no threat, just mutual acknowledgement between 2 beings whose lives had become intertwined through circumstance and choice. As the light began to fade, Survivor rose and stretched. He looked at Jack one final time, then turned and moved into the forest with the fluid grace he had developed since losing his paw. Jack watched until the dark shape disappeared among the trees, knowing somehow that this was their goodbye for the season. Soon the bear would be denning, conserving energy through the harsh mountain winter. That evening, reviewing the images on his computer, Jack was struck by what he had captured. These weren't just photographs of a wild animal, they were a conversation, without words. In frame after frame, Survivor's gaze connected directly with the lens, conveying something that Jack felt but couldn't name. Recognition, perhaps, or affirmation of the strange bond they shared. The last image was the most powerful. Just before departing, Survivor had risen to his full height, front paw outstretched in a posture that resembled a farewell. The setting sun had illuminated his form, creating a golden outline around his massive silhouette. His eyes, catching the light, seemed almost to contain a message. "Remember me." Jack sent this final image to Dr. Tanaka with no caption, no explanation. Her response came the next morning. "This is extraordinary. Most wildlife photographers spend their entire careers hoping for a shot like this. The positioning, the light, the direct engagement. It's almost as if he's posing. We're still analyzing the data from our study. But I can tell you this. What you've documented with this bear is forcing us to reconsider some fundamental assumptions about animal cognition and interspecies relationships. Whatever exists between you and this bear, it's teaching us something important. Winter settled over Pinecrest, bringing with it the quiet contemplation of the season. Jack continued his work, focusing on the creatures that remained active through the cold months, the wolves, the mountain lions, the hardy birds that made the Cascades their year-round home. But part of his mind always circled back to Survivor, wondering about the bear's den, hoping he had found a good location to wait out the winter. In December, Jack received an unexpected call from the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. Messenger, the cub they had rescued, was thriving. She had bonded with 2 other orphaned cubs and was developing the skills she would need for eventual release. "We thought you might like to see her progress," the rehabilitator said. "We've been documenting it with video if you're interested." The footage they sent showed a transformed animal from the weak, injured cub they had found tangled in fishing line. Messenger had grown into a healthy young bear, playfully wrestling with her companions, learning to forage in the naturalistic enclosures developing the wariness of humans that would serve her well in the wild. "She still has the scar around her neck," the rehabilitator noted during their call. "But otherwise, you'd never know what she went through. We're planning for a spring release, if all continues well." Jack found himself surprisingly moved by Messenger's progress. Though he had no direct connection to her beyond the rescue, she represented something important, the continuation of what Survivor had set in motion, a chain of compassion that extended beyond species boundaries. As Christmas approached, bringing with it a fresh blanket of snow, Jack received a package from Dr. Tanaka. Inside was a bound copy of her team's preliminary findings, not yet published, but shared with him as courtesy. The title caught his eye immediately: Cross-Species Altruism and Memory in Ursus Americanus, the Pinecrest Case Study. Jack spent several evenings reading through the detailed scientific analysis. Much of it was technical, filled with terminology from cognitive ethology and behavioral ecology. But the conclusions were clear even to a layman. Survivors' behavior represented a significant challenge to existing understanding of bear cognition and social behavior. The subject bear's actions, Dr. Tanaka wrote in the conclusion, demonstrate not only exceptional memory capabilities, but suggest the possibility of cross-species altruistic behavior previously undocumented in Ursus Americanus. While further research is needed, the implications for our understanding of animal consciousness are profound. Jack set the report aside, feeling a strange mixture of validation and humility. Science was beginning to confirm what he had sensed. From the beginning, that his connection with Survivor represented something extraordinary, something that stretched the boundaries of what we thought possible between humans and wild animals. Yet even with all the research, all the documentation, all the scientific language, Jack knew that the heart of this story remained ineffable. A moment of connection in a snowy clearing, a choice to help rather than harm, and the unexpected ripples that had flowed from that choice. January brought the coldest temperatures of the season, driving even the hardiest Pinecrest residents indoors. Jack used this time to organize his vast collection of wildlife photographs, selecting the best for a book he had been invited to create. The publisher had approached him after the Messenger incident made national news, offering him an opportunity to tell the full story of his encounters with Survivor alongside his broader wildlife photography. At first, Jack had hesitated. He was wary of exploiting his connection with the bear for personal gain, but Eleanor had helped him see it differently. "This isn't about profit," she had argued during a snowy evening discussion in her clinic. "This is about changing how people see these animals, how they understand our relationship with the wild. That bear trusted you with something important. Maybe this book is how you honor that trust." So Jack spent the winter months sorting through thousands of images, writing accompanying text, and working with the publisher to shape a narrative that did justice to the extraordinary events of the past 3 years. He titled the book simply, Survivor, A Story of Remembrance. February brought unexpected visitors to Pinecrest. A documentary, film crew from the National Geographic Society arrived, seeking to create a feature on Jack's encounters with Survivor and the resulting scientific research. After some consideration, Jack agreed to participate, on the condition that the documentary focus not just on the sensational aspects of the story, but on the broader implications for conservation and human-wildlife relationships. This isn't Just about one remarkable bear, he explained to the director during their initial meeting. It's about recognizing that wild animals have inner lives more complex than we've been willing to acknowledge, and about what that recognition means for how we treat them and their habitats. The filmmaker, a veteran wildlife documentarian named Sarah Okafor, nodded thoughtfully. That's exactly the story I want to tell, not just the miracle bear headline, but what it means for how we see these creatures and our responsibility toward them. Filming took place over several weeks, with Jack guiding the crew to key locations: the clearing where he had first found Survivor, the stream where they had their first post-release encounter, Miller's Creek, where the bear had led them to Messenger. The process stirred memories both painful and profound, forcing Jack to revisit and articulate experiences that had changed the course of his life. He sent the best images to Dr. Tanaka, who had returned to the university but remained deeply involved in studying the case. Her response came the next morning. "These are remarkable, Jack. The positioning, the repeated pattern, the direct eye contact all suggest conscious choice and awareness of your presence. We're preparing a new paper on spatial memory and recognition in bears, and these images provide compelling evidence for capabilities far beyond what conventional science has acknowledged." Survivor continues to expand our understanding of what's possible. June brought another milestone: Messenger's planned release back into the wild. After more than a year of rehabilitation, the young female bear had grown into a healthy subadult, displaying all the natural behaviors and appropriate wariness needed for survival in the forest. The Wildlife Center had invited Jack to witness her return to freedom. The release site had been carefully chosen, a remote area within the protected valley, rich in food sources and far from human habitation, but within the general territory where she had been found. A small group gathered for the event: the rehabilitation team, Dr. Tanaka, Elena, Tom, and Jack. All maintained a respectful distance as the transport cage was positioned at the forest edge. When the door was opened, Messenger hesitated only briefly before emerging. She stood tall, nose working the air currents, taking in the sense of her true home. Jack marveled at her transformation from the weak, injured cub they had rescued to this magnificent young bear, her only remaining mark from the ordeal: a faint stripe of lighter fur where the fishing line had scarred her neck. Unlike Survivor's release 3 years earlier, Messenger did not look back at the humans who had saved and cared for her. Instead, she moved purposefully into the forest, disappearing quickly among the trees, exactly as a wild bear should behave. The rehabilitation team exchanged satisfied nods. Her immediate retreat from human presence was the best possible outcome, a sign of proper wild instincts intact. "She's where she belongs now," Elena said softly beside Jack, "back in the world she was meant for." Jack nodded, feeling a complex mixture of emotions: joy at seeing Messenger return to freedom, a touch of sadness at the severing of connection, and a deeper satisfaction in knowing they had completed the circle that Survivor had begun when he led them to the trapped cub. "Do you think she'll encounter Survivor?" Jack asked as they hiked back toward the vehicles. Elena considered this thoughtfully. "It's possible. Their territories might overlap. But remember, male bears aren't typically social, and they're often dangerous to younger bears. If they do meet, we can only hope he somehow recognizes her." "He might," Dr. Tanaka interjected, having overheard their conversation. "We've been analyzing all of our observations, and it's clear that Survivor possesses exceptional recognition abilities. He not only remembers you, Jack, but seems to associate you specifically with assistance and safety. It's not impossible that he might recognize Messenger as well, particularly given the unusual circumstances of their connection. The thought was intriguing, the possibility that somewhere in these mountains, the two bears whose lives had been saved through this remarkable chain of events might cross paths, might somehow recognize their shared history. It was a story without an observer, a connection that would remain hidden in the secret lives of wild creatures. As summer reached its peak, Jack found himself drawn increasingly to exploring the more philosophical implications of his experiences with Survivor. The bear had challenged not just scientific understanding of animal cognition, but deeper cultural assumptions about the boundaries between humans and wild creatures. One evening, sitting on his cabin porch watching the sunset paint the distant peaks with gold, Jack discussed these thoughts with Elena and Marcus, who had stopped by with a bottle of wine and questions about the upcoming National Geographic documentary. "The film crew keeps asking me how this experience has changed me," Jack said, swirling the wine in his glass. "I struggle to articulate it fully." "That's not surprising," Eleanor replied. "You've experienced something most people never will. Genuine connection with a truly wild creature. Not a trained animal, not something habituated to humans, but a wild bear that chose to trust you." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "My grandfather used to talk about the old relationship between hunters and prey, how in many indigenous traditions animals were believed to offer themselves willingly if treated with proper respect. Modern science dismissed those ideas as primitive anthropomorphism." He fixed Jack with a meaningful look. "But your experiences with Survivor suggest something more complex is possible." "That's exactly it," Jack said, leaning forward. "We've created this artificial separation, humans. Here, wild nature there, a clear boundary between. But what if that boundary is more permeable than we've allowed ourselves to believe? What if other forms of connection are possible when we approach with respect and openness?" "The scientific community is struggling with these questions too," Elena added. "Dr. Tanaka told me her team is facing some pushback on their papers. Some colleagues argue they're overinterpreting anecdotal evidence, projecting human qualities onto animal behavior." Jack smiled slightly. "I understand their skepticism. If I hadn't experienced it myself, I might share it. But having looked into Survivor's eyes, having witnessed his choices," he shook his head, "there's something there that defies our comfortable categories." As July gave way to August, the National Geographic documentary neared completion. The film crew returned to Pinecrest for final interviews and to capture the summer landscape of the protected valley. Jack had seen a rough cut of the film, titled "The Bear Who Remembered," and had been moved by how skillfully it balanced the extraordinary personal story with broader scientific and conservation themes. Later that night, as a full harvest moon rose over the mountains, Jack sat on his cabin porch with Elena and Marcus, sharing a bottle of wine and comfortable silence. The protected valley stretched before them, silver in the moonlight, a testament to what was possible when humans chose to live in relationship with, rather than opposition to, the natural world. "What happens next?" Elena finally asked, voicing the question that had been on all their minds since the documentary's completion. Jack considered this thoughtfully. For Survivor and Messenger, they'll follow their own paths. Winter's coming. They'll den soon, hibernate through the cold months, emerge in spring to continue their lives in the forest. With luck, we'll glimpse them occasionally, but their story belongs to them now. And for you? Marcus pressed gently. Jack smiled, looking out at the moonlit landscape. I've been thinking about that. The documentary has created interest in a book, not just about Survivor, but about rethinking our relationship with wild creatures generally, and the university has asked if I'd consider teaching a course on conservation photography. You'd be good at that, Elena observed. You see things others miss. Maybe, Jack acknowledged. But whatever I do, it will be grounded in what these past 3 years have taught me. That compassion matters, that connection is possible across differences we thought insurmountable, and that when we approach the natural world with respect, rather than dominance, remarkable things become possible. As they talked into the night, somewhere in the protected valley, 2 bears were preparing for winter. One, a scarred veteran who had survived against all odds, the other, a young female, whose life had been saved through an extraordinary chain of compassion and memory. Their story had changed, not just their own lives, but the lives of an entire community, rippling outward in ways that would continue long after that night. And it had all begun with a simple choice, a choice to help rather than turn away, to connect rather than separate, to recognize the fundamental bond that exists between all living beings when we have the courage to see it. In that choice lay a powerful truth that Jack had come to understand through his journey with Survivor, that in a world that often seemed divided by boundaries of species and self-interest, compassion remained the most powerful force for healing, not just for individual wounds, but for the artificial separations we have created between ourselves and the natural world that is our true home. The silence that followed their departure was profound, a collective moment of awe at what they had witnessed. Then conversation erupted, people turning to each other with excited voices and amazed expressions. Phones were checked to confirm that yes, they had captured what just happened. No, they weren't imagining the deliberate nature of the bear's actions. Jack remained by the boulder, still holding the fish vertebra, his mind racing with the implications of what had just occurred. Tom joined him, the disabled trap now sealed in an evidence bag. This changes everything, the wildlife officer said quietly. Not just about how we understand these particular bears, but about what might be possible between humans and wildlife more broadly. Jack nodded, words temporarily beyond him as he processed the magnitude of Survivor's actions. The bear had not only remembered him, not only formed a social group that defied scientific understanding, but had actively sought human assistance to address a threat in his environment. The cognitive abilities, the emotional intelligence, the trust required for such behavior went far beyond what conventional science attributed to wild animals. Over the following days, Survivor's extraordinary act sparked a new wave of attention on Pinecrest and the protected valley. Tom organized a systematic search of the area, discovering and removing 5 more illegal traps similar to the one Survivor had brought to town. The fact that a wild bear had essentially reported illegal poaching activity made headlines around the world, bringing renewed focus to both animal intelligence and conservation efforts. Dr. Tanaka arrived with a team of cognitive ethologists and bear behavior specialists, hoping to document any further interactions with the unconventional bear family. Camera traps were strategically placed throughout the valley, though Jack privately doubted that Survivor would allow himself to be so easily observed. The bear had always seemed to choose when and how their encounters would occur, displaying an awareness of human observation that bordered on uncanny. As winter deepened across the Cascades, Jack found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this point. What had begun as a simple act of compassion, a doctor unable to walk away from suffering, had blossomed into something that challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between humans and wild animals. One evening, as snow fell, gently outside his cabin windows, Jack sat with Elena, Marcus, and Dr. Tanaka, discussing the broader implications of what they had witnessed. The traditional scientific view has been that attributing complex emotions or intentionality to wild animals is anthropomorphism, projecting human qualities where they don't exist, Dr. Tanaka said, warming her hands around a mug of tea. But survivors' behavior forces us to reconsider that position. What we've observed suggests recognition, memory, problem-solving, and possibly even gratitude or trust, cognitive and emotional capacities that go well beyond what we've generally acknowledged in bears. It's not just about this one exceptional bear, though, Marcus added thoughtfully. It's about what his story reveals about possibilities we've overlooked because of our assumptions. If one bear can form this kind of connection, what else might be possible if we approach the natural world with openness rather than dominance? Elena nodded agreement. I've been thinking about this from a veterinary perspective. We've made such advances in understanding animal cognition and emotional lives in domestic species. But we've been much more reluctant to extend that understanding to wild creatures, perhaps because it challenges our justification for how we've treated them and their habitats. Jack listened, turning the weathered salmon vertebra in his fingers, a tangible symbol of the connection he shared with Survivor. What strikes me most, he said finally, is how this experience has revealed connections that were always there, but that we chose not to see. Survivor didn't suddenly develop these capacities because I helped him. He always had them. The change was in my willingness to recognize them. The conversation continued late into the night, touching on philosophy, conservation ethics, indigenous perspectives on human-animal relationships, and the practical implications for wildlife management. What emerged was a sense that Survivor's story offered not just a remarkable anecdote, but a potential paradigm shift in how humans might relate to the natural world. As the winter solstice approached, the darkest point of the year, with the promise of returning light to follow, Jack received an unexpected message from the ranger station. Trail cameras had captured images of Survivor, Messenger, and the cubs entering what appeared to be a communal den site. Though black bears typically denned individually, these four had once again defied conventional understanding by creating a shared winter refuge. The location is about half a mile from where you first found him in the trap, Tom told Jack when he shared the images, almost like they've come full circle. The symbolism wasn't lost on Jack. The bear, whose life he had saved, had not only survived but had thrived, creating a new family structure that challenged scientific understanding and demonstrating cognitive abilities that expanded our conception of what wild animals could comprehend. On the morning of the solstice, with the year's shortest day dawning crisp and clear over the mountains, Jack hiked alone to the ridge that had become a sacred place in his personal geography, the spot where Survivor had first brought him the salmon vertebra, where their connection had been acknowledged in ways beyond words. The sun rose slowly over the eastern peaks, painting the snow-covered landscape with gold and rose. Jack set up his camera, capturing the interplay of light and shadow across the protected valley, the valley that would remain wild because of one bear's extraordinary actions and the human response to them. As the first full rays of sunlight crested the mountains, Jack sensed, rather than heard, a presence behind him. Turning slowly, camera in hand, he found himself face to face with Survivor once more. The bear stood alone at the edge of the trees, his coat thick for winter, his eyes bright with that intelligence that had never ceased to move Jack deeply. For a long moment they regarded each other across the space between man and bear, two conscious beings whose lives had become intertwined through chance and choice and compassion. No words were needed, no scientific explanations required. This was communication at its most fundamental, the recognition of one aware presence by another, across boundaries that suddenly seemed far more permeable than humans had been willing to acknowledge. Jack raised his hand in their shared gesture of greeting. Survivor lowered his massive head slightly in what could only be described as a nod, then turned and moved back into the forest with the fluid grace he had developed in the years since, losing his paw. As the bear disappeared among the trees, Jack felt not sadness, but a profound sense of rightness. Survivor would soon be in his den with Messenger and the cubs, sleeping through the cold months to emerge in spring and continue their remarkable existence. They were wild creatures, meant to live according to their own nature, not as subjects of human curiosity or scientific study. Yet the connection remained, a bridge built from one act of compassion that had grown into something that would continue, to inspire and challenge all who heard their story. For in saving Survivor's life that snowy morning 3 years ago, Jack had not just helped one bear, he had opened a window into possibilities for relationship between humans and the natural world that many had forgotten or never known. As Jack hiked back to Pinecrest that afternoon, the winter sun already beginning its early descent, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. When he left his surgical career in Seattle and moved to these mountains, he had been seeking solitude, a place to heal from the emotional toll of years in the trauma center. What he had found instead was connection, not just with one remarkable bear, but with a community of humans and animals that existed in relationship with each other when approached with respect and openness. That evening, as darkness fell across, the Cascades and the stars emerged in a crystal-clear sky. Jack sat at his desk, finalizing the epilogue for the paperback edition of his book. The words came easily now, flowing from the deeper understanding he had gained through his extraordinary experiences. When I found Survivor in that trap 3 years ago, I acted from a healer's instinct, the simple inability to walk away from suffering. I never expected anything in return, never imagined that this one act of compassion would ripple outward to change not just my life, but the lives of an entire community and the fate of a wilderness valley. Yet what I've learned through this remarkable journey is that compassion creates connections that endure, that transcend the boundaries we've created between ourselves and the natural world. In Survivor's eyes, I glimpsed a truth that many of us have forgotten, that we exist within a community of living beings capable of recognition, memory, and relationship across differences we once thought insurmountable. This is not just the story of one extraordinary bear, though Survivor is indeed remarkable in ways that continue to challenge scientific understanding. It is a reminder of what becomes possible when we approach the natural world not as separate masters, but as respectful participants in the community of life. 3 years ago, in a snowy clearing, I made a choice to help rather than turn away. That choice returned to me in ways I could never have imagined. In the eyes of a bear who remembered, in the salvation of an orphaned cub, in the protection of a wilderness valley, and in the shifting of perspectives about what might be possible between humans and wild animals. Perhaps the greatest gift of this experience has been the reminder that kindness matters, that compassion creates ripples we cannot predict, and that when we have the courage to reach across the boundaries that separate us from the natural world, extraordinary connections become possible. Survivor taught all of us who have witnessed his remarkable story, that the wild is not something separate from humanity, but something we are part of, deeply and inextricably. In remembering this truth, in honoring these connections, we find not just a more harmonious way of living within the web of life, but a more complete way of being human. Jack set down his pen, feeling the rightness of these words as a physical sensation of warmth in his chest. Outside his cabin window, the full moon rose over the mountains, illuminating the protected valley, where Survivor, Messenger, and their cubs now slept in their winter den. In the morning, he would send these final pages to his publisher. The paperback edition would reach even more readers, spreading the story of Survivor and the lessons his remarkable journey offered. The National Geographic documentary continued to air internationally, inspiring conservation initiatives and challenging assumptions about animal cognition. The protected valley had become a model for community-based conservation, a testament to what was possible when humans chose relationship over exploitation. As for Jack himself, he had found his path forward, using his photography and storytelling to help others see the wild with new eyes, to recognize the intelligence and awareness that existed in creatures too often dismissed as operating on mere instinct. In the spring, he would begin teaching a course at the university on conservation photography, sharing what he had learned about capturing images that revealed relationship rather than simply documenting appearance. Life in Pinecrest had found a new equilibrium, with the community embracing its role as steward of the remarkable wilderness that surrounded it. The logging company that had once sought to harvest the valley's timber had become a partner in sustainable forest management, finding economic opportunities that preserved rather than destroyed the ecosystem's integrity. Eleanor's veterinary practice had expanded to include a wildlife rehabilitation component, offering care for injured animals and education for residents and visitors alike. Marcus had developed a wilderness guide service focused on respectful wildlife observation, teaching photographers and nature enthusiasts how to move through the forest with minimal impact. Even Tom, once the most skeptical about Jack's connection with Survivor, had become an advocate for a more nuanced understanding of bear behavior and intelligence. His presentations to other wildlife officers incorporated what they had learned from Survivor's extraordinary actions, encouraging a management approach that recognized bears as individuals with varying personalities and cognitive abilities rather than interchangeable threats to be controlled. As the night deepened around his cabin, Jack stepped onto the porch for one final look at the moonlit mountains before sleep. The air was crystalline with cold, the stars impossibly bright above the dark silhouettes of the pines. Somewhere in those mountains, Survivor and his unconventional family slept in their winter den, wild and free, yet connected to the human community in ways that defied easy explanation. Jack felt a profound gratitude wash over him, gratitude for the chance encounter that had brought him and Survivor together, for the community that had ultimately embraced this extraordinary story, and for the wilderness that continued to teach him new ways of seeing and being in relationship with the natural world. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying the ancient voice of the mountains. Jack listened, sensing in that sound a truth he had been circling toward since that first morning in the snow, that healing comes not from separation, but from connection, not from dominance, but from companionship, not from control, but from compassion. In saving Survivor, Jack had found his own way forward, a path of relationship with the wild that honored the intelligence and awareness of all living beings. And in the story they now shared, others were finding their own connections, their own ways of reimagining how humans might live in harmony with the natural world that was, after all, their true and original home. As he turned to go inside, Jack knew that whatever the future held, the connection he shared with Survivor would endure, not just in his memory or in the books and films that documented their remarkable journey, but in the changed understanding their story had sparked about what was possible between humans and wild creatures when approached with respect, openness, and compassion. For in that connection lay a profound hope for the future, the possibility that humans might remember their place in the community of life, might recognize the intelligence and awareness that exists throughout the natural world, and might choose relationship over separation, compassion over indifference, and stewardship over exploitation. This was Survivor's greatest gift, not just to Jack, but to all who heard their story. The reminder that in a world too often defined by boundaries and divisions, compassion remained the most powerful force for healing, not just for individual wounds, but for the artificial separations humans had created between themselves and the wild earth that had always been their home. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.